In the middle of segregation, when most Black Americans were fighting just to survive, one man was quietly building a business empire powerful enough to rival wealthy white elites. His name was A.G. Gaston, a millionaire hotel mogul whose fortune was almost unheard of for a Black man in America at the time. But his boldest move came when he stepped into the civil rights movement and helped bail Martin Luther King Jr. out of jail. In this video, we uncover the forgotten empire and influence of A.G. Gaston. Part number 1. The Black Millionaire Nobody Expected. In the early 1900s, the idea of a Black millionaire in America sounded almost impossible. This was the era of segregation, when Black families across the South were trapped in a system designed to keep them poor, powerless, and invisible. Opportunities were limited. Banks refused loans, white business owners controlled entire industries, and even basic rights could be taken away overnight. For most Black Americans, survival itself was already a daily battle. But while millions struggled under that system, one man in Alabama was quietly studying it. Long before he became known as a millionaire hotel mogul, A.G. Gaston was just a young boy growing up in poverty in the Deep South. He was born in 1892 in Demopolis, Alabama, during a time when racial violence and economic oppression shaped nearly every part of Black life. The odds against him were enormous from the very beginning. And yet, even as a child, Gaston seemed to understand something many people around him did not. He realized that the people with the most power were not always politicians or public figures. In America, real power often belonged to the people who controlled money, businesses, land, and access. That realization would eventually change his entire life. As a teenager, Gaston worked multiple small jobs just to survive. He sold food, performed labor jobs, and searched constantly for ways to earn extra income. But unlike most people around him, he wasn't thinking only about making money for the day. He was studying people, watching how businesses operated, learning where money moved, observing what Black communities desperately needed but could not easily access because of segregation. And what he noticed was a massive gap. Black Americans were often denied services that white-owned businesses freely provided to white customers. Insurance was difficult to get. Banking services were limited. Hotels and accommodations were segregated. Funeral services were expensive and controlled by white operators. Entire Black communities were being economically excluded from systems everyone else depended on. Most people saw discrimination. Gaston saw opportunity. That mindset became the foundation of everything he would later build. One of his earliest breakthroughs came through the funeral business. At the time, funeral services were one of the few industries where Black ownership could still grow inside segregated communities. Gaston recognized that families would always need burial services, regardless of economic conditions. More importantly, he understood that trust mattered deeply in Black communities that had been repeatedly exploited by outsiders. So he entered the business world carefully, learning how money flowed through these essential services. But Gaston was never satisfied with owning just one business. That was the difference between him and many entrepreneurs of his era. While others focused on surviving one industry, Gaston focused on building systems. He wanted businesses that connected to each other. Businesses that kept money circulating inside Black communities while also expanding his influence. Every new company became another piece of a much larger machine. And slowly, that machine began to grow. Over time, he expanded into insurance, one of the most powerful industries in America. During segregation, many Black families were denied access to proper insurance coverage, leaving entire communities financially vulnerable during emergencies and deaths. Gaston stepped directly into that gap, offering services many people had struggled for years to obtain. The demand exploded. As more customers trusted his businesses, his wealth began increasing rapidly. But what made Gaston different wasn't just the money. It was the scale of his ambition. He wasn't thinking like a local businessman. He was thinking like a future empire builder. And in segregated America, that was extremely dangerous. Because the more successful a Black businessman became during that era, the more attention he attracted. Wealth brought visibility. Visibility brought resentment. And resentment in the Deep South could become deadly very quickly. But Gaston kept expanding anyway. While many Black Americans were denied access to financial systems, Gaston began creating his own. He entered banking, investments, and real estate. He studied how wealthy white businessmen built generational influence and started applying similar strategies inside black communities. Instead of depending on existing systems, he began constructing parallel systems that served people. Segregation had pushed aside. That approach made him incredibly powerful. By the mid-20th century, Gaston was no longer just another businessman in Alabama. He was becoming one of the wealthiest black men in America. His businesses stretched across multiple industries, and his name carried enormous influence throughout Birmingham and beyond. People started noticing the cars, the expensive properties, the luxury lifestyle, the growing empire. And perhaps most shocking of all, white businessmen who once ignored black entrepreneurs now had no choice but to acknowledge him. Gaston had built something too large to overlook. But success during segregation came with constant pressure. Black businessmen who became wealthy often had to operate carefully between two worlds. On one side, black communities viewed them as symbols of hope and progress. On the other side, powerful white institutions watched them closely, especially if they appeared too influential, too independent, or too connected to growing civil rights activism. Gaston understood that balance better than most. Publicly, he focused heavily on business. He spoke about economic growth, ownership, and financial independence. He believed black Americans needed not just political rights, but economic power. To him, wealth created leverage, businesses created stability, ownership created protection, and, over time, his empire became more than just a collection of companies. It became a symbol. For many black families in Birmingham, Gaston represented something they rarely saw during segregation. Proof that success was still possible inside a system designed to prevent it. His hotels, businesses, and financial institutions showed that black ownership could exist on a massive scale, even under extreme discrimination. But behind that success was a growing reality that Gaston could not avoid forever. America was changing. The civil rights movement was beginning to rise. Tensions in Birmingham were becoming explosive, and soon, one of the richest black businessmen in the South would find himself pulled directly into the center of one of the most dangerous struggles in American history. 2. Inside A.G. Gaston's massive business empire. By the 1950s, A.G. Gaston was no longer just a successful businessman. He had become something far more unusual for that era. A black power broker in the Deep South. And in segregated America, power like that was almost unheard of. While most people outside Alabama had never heard his name, inside Birmingham, Gaston's influence was everywhere. His businesses touched nearly every part of black life. If someone needed insurance, there was a good chance Gaston's company handled it. If a family needed funeral services, Gaston-owned businesses were involved. If black travelers needed safe accommodations during segregation, Gaston's properties became some of the few places they could stay comfortably. What he built wasn't just a company, it was an entire economic network. And the deeper people looked into his empire, the more unbelievable it became. At a time when many black Americans struggled to get basic loans or enter white-owned hotels, Gaston was quietly building wealth across multiple industries. Insurance became one of his biggest weapons. He understood something most people overlooked. During segregation, black communities were massively underserved financially. Traditional institutions either ignored them completely or offered poor services. Gaston stepped directly into that gap. His insurance business grew rapidly because it offered something many black families rarely received from larger institutions: access and dignity. Customers trusted him because they felt his businesses actually understood their lives and struggles. That trust turned into millions. But Gaston didn't stop there. He expanded aggressively into real estate, investing in buildings, properties, and commercial spaces throughout Birmingham. While other people spent money trying to appear wealthy, Gaston focused on owning the systems that generated wealth: land, buildings, financial services, essential businesses. The strategy worked. Year after year, his influence grew larger. And then came the hotels. During segregation, black travelers faced constant humiliation across America. Many hotels refused black guests entirely, forcing families, entertainers, athletes, and business people to rely on small black-owned establishments while traveling through the South. Gaston recognized this problem immediately. So he built solutions. One of the most famous was the Gaston Motel in Birmingham, a property that would later become deeply connected to the civil rights movement. But at the time, it represented something else entirely: black luxury and independence. The motel stood out because it offered an experience rarely available to black travelers during segregation. Clean rooms, professional service, safety, comfort, privacy. For many visitors, walking into the Gaston Motel felt like entering a completely different world from the hostility outside. And soon, some of the most important black figures in America began passing through its doors: business leaders, entertainers, civil rights organizers, influential visitors from across the country. The motel slowly became more than just a business. It became a gathering place for black excellence during one of the most divided periods in American history. And the money flowing through Gaston's empire only continued to grow. At his peak, estimates suggested Gaston's fortune reached tens of millions of dollars, an astonishing figure for that era, especially for a black businessman operating in the segregated South. In today's money, his wealth would likely translate into an even larger fortune. But what made Gaston especially powerful wasn't just how much money he had. It was how strategically he used it. Unlike flashy businessmen who chased attention, Gaston understood influence. He knew that owning businesses gave him leverage inside both black and white communities. Politicians respected wealth. Bankers respected ownership. Even people who disliked successful black businessmen still had to acknowledge economic power when they saw it. And slowly, Gaston became impossible to ignore. White businessmen who once dismissed black entrepreneurship began recognizing that Gaston had built something extremely rare. His companies employed people, controlled assets, generated revenue, influenced communities. In many ways, he had created a parallel economic structure during segregation. That kind of independence made people nervous, especially in Birmingham. At the time, Birmingham had earned one of the darkest reputations in America when it came to racial violence and segregation. The city was so hostile toward black advancement that it later became known by some as Bombingham because of the repeated attacks targeting black homes, churches, and businesses. And yet, right in the middle of that environment, Gaston was building luxury businesses and accumulating enormous wealth. To supporters, he became a symbol of black economic success. To critics, he became something else entirely: a threat. Because segregation depended heavily on economic control. The system worked best when black communities remained financially dependent on white-owned institutions. But Gaston's empire challenged that structure directly. Every business he opened created more black jobs, more black ownership, and more black financial independence. That influence extended beyond money. As his empire expanded, Gaston gained access to powerful networks throughout Birmingham. Business leaders knew him, politicians knew him, activists knew him. Even national figures became aware of the wealthy businessman quietly operating in Alabama. But while Gaston focused heavily on business, the country around him was beginning to change rapidly. The civil rights movement was growing louder. Protests were spreading. Tensions between activists and segregationists were escalating across the South. And Birmingham was becoming one of the most dangerous battlegrounds in America. For wealthy black businessmen like Gaston, this created a complicated situation. Many successful entrepreneurs feared that openly supporting civil rights activism could destroy everything they had built. Public association with protests often attracted retaliation from white officials, banks, law enforcement, and violent extremists. And Gaston had far more to lose than most people. He had businesses, employees, properties, millions of dollars tied to a city filled with racial tension. So for a time, he tried to balance both worlds, maintaining his business empire while carefully navigating the growing political storm around him. But that balancing act would not last forever, because soon, Birmingham would explode into national headlines. And when one of the most important civil rights leaders in America landed behind bars, A.G. Gaston would face the biggest and most dangerous decision of his entire life. October 3, the night he stepped into history. By the early 1960s, Birmingham, Alabama had become one of the most dangerous cities in America for black citizens. Tensions were no longer simmering quietly in the background. They were exploding in public view. Protests were growing, sit-ins were spreading, and civil rights leaders were deliberately challenging the system that had controlled the South for decades. And at the center of it all was Martin Luther King Jr., whose presence in Birmingham had turned the city into a national battlefield. For most wealthy black businessmen, this was the moment to stay quiet. Staying neutral meant survival. Speaking up meant risk. Supporting the movement openly could mean losing everything: businesses, property, safety, even life. And no one understood that balance better than A.G. Gaston. At this point, Gaston had already built an empire most people could only imagine. His insurance companies, banks, real estate holdings, and the famous Gaston Motel had made him one of the most powerful black businessmen in the South. But power in Birmingham was fragile. The same city that made him wealthy was also capable of destroying everything he had built overnight. And that danger was not theoretical. It was real, constant, and escalating. Birmingham had become infamous for violence against black progress. Homes were bombed, churches were attacked, businesses linked to civil rights activity were targeted. Fear was not just a feeling, it was part of daily life. Even the Gaston Motel, one of his most valuable properties, was not safe. But despite the risks, the motel had become something far more important than a business. It had turned into a meeting place for civil rights leaders, activists, and organizers. Behind its doors, strategies were discussed, movements were planned, and history was being shaped in real time. And that made it a target. Then came the moment that changed everything. In April 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Birmingham during protests against segregation. His imprisonment sent shockwaves through the movement. For many supporters, it was a crisis. For opponents, it was a statement of power. And for those inside the movement, it created an urgent question: who would step forward to help? King's bail was set, but the situation was complicated. Financial and legal support for civil rights leaders was dangerous. Anyone connected to helping him could easily become a target themselves. Many wealthy individuals hesitated. Some refused outright, but Gaston made a decision that would define his legacy forever. He stepped in. Quietly, without public attention or dramatic speeches, Gaston helped secure the funds needed for King's release. It was not just an act of generosity, it was an act of enormous personal risk. In Birmingham at that time, financially supporting civil rights activism could draw intense backlash from segregationists, law enforcement, and extremist groups. And Gaston knew it. He understood exactly what he was walking into. Because by helping Martin Luther King Jr. leave jail, he was no longer just a businessman operating in the background of history. He had entered the center of it. The reaction was immediate, even if not always public. Inside certain circles, his name began circulating differently. Some saw him as courageous, a wealthy black man finally using his influence for change. Others saw him as dangerous, a businessman whose empire could now be tied to one of the most controversial movements in America. And the danger didn't stop there. As the civil rights movement intensified in Birmingham, violence escalated as well. The Gaston Motel itself became a symbol of that tension. It wasn't just a place for travelers anymore. It was now associated with movement leadership, strategy meetings, and organizing efforts. That association made it a target. The motel was bombed during the height of civil rights unrest in Birmingham, sending a clear message about how far opposition was willing to go to intimidate activists and their supporters. The attack shocked the nation, but for Gaston, it was a direct warning. His businesses were no longer just commercial assets. They were now part of a political battlefield. And still, he did not step back. Instead, he continued navigating the impossible position he was in. On one side, he had built a massive business empire that depended on stability and protection. On the other hand, he was now connected to one of the most transformative social movements in American history. Every decision carried weight, every association carried risk, and every public perception could shift the future of everything he had built. Even federal authorities were paying attention. The FBI was closely monitoring civil rights activity, and anyone linked to major figures like Martin Luther King Jr. inevitably came under scrutiny. Gaston's name, influence, and financial power made him impossible to ignore completely. But what made him even more interesting was his silence. He was not a loud activist. He was not a public speaker in the movement. He was something more complicated, a behind-the-scenes force operating at the intersection of business, survival, and change. And that complexity made him one of the most important yet least understood figures of the era. Because while history often remembers the voices that spoke the loudest, it rarely highlights the people who made those voices possible. Gaston was one of those people. But as the movement continued to grow and Birmingham became more unstable, the question shifted from what he had already done to what it would cost him next. And the answer to that question would determine whether his empire survived the storm he had stepped into or became another casualty of a city on fire with change. Hunter number 4. The Forgotten Empire. America almost erased. By the time the civil rights movement reshaped America, the name A.G. Gaston had already become complicated. To some, he was a symbol of black success in the middle of segregation. To others, he was a quiet force working behind the scenes of change. But as the years passed, something unexpected happened. His story began to fade. Not because it was unimportant, but because it didn't fit the loud, dramatic version of history people usually remember. Most people recall the visible leaders of the era, the speeches, the marches, the confrontations. But Gaston was different. He wasn't on the front lines. He was a builder. He created systems that allowed others to survive, organize, and grow. And history often forgets the people who operate in the background. Yet his empire was very real. Even after segregation weakened, Gaston's influence remained deeply rooted in Birmingham. His insurance companies, banks, real estate investments, and the famous Gaston Motel had already changed what black economic independence looked like in the South. For many families, his businesses were not just services. They were access points to dignity in a system that denied them elsewhere. But as America integrated, everything began to shift. New opportunities opened for Black Americans in mainstream institutions. That also meant increased competition, changing markets, and the slow decline of some segregated-era Black business networks that once thrived out of necessity. Gaston adapted, but the world around him was no longer the same world that made his empire essential. Still, his impact never disappeared. It simply became less visible. Inside Birmingham, his legacy remained tied to real structures, buildings, companies, and institutions that had shaped entire generations. The Gaston Motel, in particular, stood as a powerful reminder of a time when business, survival, and civil rights were deeply connected. It wasn't just a hotel. It was a meeting point, a safe space, and at one point a center of historical decision-making. And yet, outside of those circles, his name slowly faded from mainstream conversation. What remained was something more permanent than attention: legacy. In modern discussions about wealth and influence, comparisons are often made to today's billionaires and global business leaders. But Gaston's rise happened under far harsher conditions. He built during segregation, when access to banking, property, and opportunity for Black Americans was severely restricted. His success wasn't just financial. It was structural. He built systems where systems were denied. And that is what makes his story so powerful. He didn't operate in a world that supported him. He built within one designed to limit him. Even his connection to Martin Luther King Jr., particularly his decision to help secure King's release from jail, reflects how deeply he was tied to one of the most important movements in American history. But unlike many figures of the era, Gaston rarely stood in the spotlight. He worked quietly, but his influence reached far beyond what most people realized. Over time, however, quiet influence is often the easiest to forget. History tends to highlight those who speak the loudest or appear the most visible. But behind every movement, there are people who fund, support, build, and stabilize it. Gaston belonged to that category. The kind of figure whose impact is massive but not always fully recognized. Even today, the structures he built continue to echo through Black entrepreneurship in America. His businesses created jobs when jobs were denied. His institutions provided financial access when mainstream systems excluded entire communities. His model proved that black economic power could exist even under extreme oppression. And yet, many people still don't know his name. That is the contradiction of his legacy. A man who built millions in wealth, influenced civil rights history, and shaped economic pathways for generations, slowly becoming a forgotten figure in the broader story of America. But forgetting him doesn't erase what he built. It only makes his story more important to tell. Because A.G. Gaston was never just a businessman. He was proof that even in the most restrictive systems, structure, strategy, and vision could still create power, and that some of the most influential figures in history are the ones who never needed the spotlight to change the world. And that is the story of A.G. Gaston, a man who built a multi-million-dollar empire in a system designed to keep him powerless, yet still became part of one of the most important moments in American history. His influence was massive, but his name is often overlooked. If this story opened your eyes to a hidden side of history, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Black Status, and stay tuned for more untold stories like this.